weren't 8 seconds ago, but we are now. Slight technical issues, which it wouldn't be our show if we didn't.
Well, it's been a while since we've done that.
I know. So anyway,
it was me.
It's fun to be live. I'm Barbara Tanner Wallace. I'm here with my bestie and business partner, Donna Jones Allward, and we're doing our October writing room. How you doing, Donna?
I don't know. that sort of discombobulated me. I've been really busy and just it seems like I have a lot on my plate.
Well, you have a book due soon.
Yeah, and I'm not making a lot of forward motion on it. So, but I'm still really busy. So I don't know. It'll get there. It's the quandary of a writer, I guess.
I know people think that writers sit around and don't do a lot except, think and then put out words. And it's amazing how busy we are on non-writing things. My
to-do list has just been a lot. And,
and
some life stuff. So tomorrow I'm heading back up to see my mama, who is still in hospital. And I'll be visiting my oldest, who is just finishing her first trimester. So I know it's got a little baby bump. So I'm going to see her. And yeah, so I'm going to do that for a couple of days, which also eats into the work stuff, but family.
That's true. Well, I did the same thing because I finished my novella, but last week I got very little done because my cat had to go into emergency surgery.
Oh my God, that poor cat. Actually, the poor Barb.
The second time, my cat ate a foreign object and had to have his intestines opened and taken out. And it's actually on his chart, known eater of foreign objects. It's embarrassing.
Anyway, something.
So today we're going to do show versus tell.
We are. And we were just saying before we started that this was actually we were so excited to do this topic, and then actually putting it together was harder than we expected.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back a little bit to like my innocent days when I was still in high school, because I was a really big English class geek. And I actually had great electives in high school, and I took 3 English classes in my grade 12 year. And my favorite teacher was Jerry Kemp. And in my yearbook, he wrote, "Show, don't tell." And it was really great that I had a mentor at a really young age. And I was so thrilled that he'd written in my book. And he encouraged me to do my degree and keep writing. And I knew what he meant by show, don't tell, but I only knew it in principle in a really sort of novice sort of way. So don't tell me what's happening, show it to me. Like paint the picture, put me in the scene.
Yep.
But then if I go back, I didn't really get it because if you read my first manuscript or maybe even my first half dozen, my understanding of this concept was definitely a work in progress. And so how do you get from paint the picture and put me in the scene to actually showing? And is there an actual method? So what you and I were going to do today is give some top tips to ensure that you're showing in your writing. Honestly, the moment I start talking, I have company.
Hello, Romeo.
He's so silly. So silly. All right. So before we get into the tips, we should explain or examine what telling is.
Yep. Here, let me pull up my slides that I did at 1:55.
Yeah, we kind of forgot about the slides, but that's okay. Telling is when you, the writer, summarize what's happening through exposition. So in an earlier segment, we were talking about how sometimes telling is appropriate, especially if it's a part of the story with low emotional stakes and you really just need to get some information across and you don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. But most of the time, he's howling now. Most of the time you want your writing to come alive. And that happens when you show what's happening because it draws the reader into the story and into the lives of your characters. So the example that we have is Bob stormed out of the office, furious that his ideas were, again, ignored. So the phrase furious that his ideas, etc., explains why he stormed out of the office. And I think explain is the key word here, because the only 2 people who know really why Bob stormed out of the office are Bob and you, the writer. And so we're not in Bob's head. We have an inkling as to why he stormed out of the office, but we really don't know his motivation. So we're explaining it to the reader. Showing, on the other hand, is using action. You want to bring up the next slide?
I'm going to the next slide. Go.
There we go. Using action, interior monologues, deep point of view, and sensory language to depict what's happening on the page. And so the key difference is the author doesn't explain, but rather the readers interpret the information to understand the scene. So you're not hand feeding it to them. They read it and they assimilate it themselves. So I rewrote the example with something that's a little more showy and less telly. So Bob stood knocking over his chair and rushed from the office, slamming the door behind him with a bang that made the windows rattle. He was so tired of being ignored. He had ideas, good ones, but not once in his years at Acme Anvil had anyone ever listened. I don't know why I came up with Acme Anvil. It just cracked me up. But you can see he doesn't just rush from the room. We see his actions. We're drawn into the movements because you can visualize the movements. And then we show why he's so upset. It's just not that his ideas are ignored, but he's been there a long, long time and no one ever listens to him. So I guess that's sort of our way of differentiating showing versus telling.
Right. We should point out first is that we were in Bob's head for the whole time versus the author intruding. We should mention, though, that when it comes to readers, show versus tell is very subjective. What one reader sees as unnecessary telling, another might not. It's also very genre dependent. Thriller readers are not going to want to slow down the experience with a lot of unnecessary details. A literary reader, on the other hand, does. They read for the language. So are you confused yet? Join the club, because I've been writing for 20 years and still it's show versus tell is very murky and it's very complicated. There is no way we are going to cover all this comprehensively in 30 minutes. So what we're going to do is offer a few beginner tips to get you started and avoid some of the pitfalls of being too telly.
Right. All right. So tip number 1 is assume the reader is intelligent enough to figure things out for themselves. So when you're telling the reader something, it almost implies that you don't trust the reader to understand what's going on. But, we are people watchers, most of us, and we spend our entire lives reading body language and other clues in order to understand what's happening around us. So, readers are smart enough to interpret the same info on the page. And it's funny because my very first critique partner, and we started critiquing for each other, I think in 2002 or 3, before either of us sold. And we did that for many, many years. And she used to write in the margins. This was before track changed. Oh my Lord, so long ago. But she would write or just type in and highlight it in red, RUE. And that was resist the urge to explain, because explaining is telling. So again, in the above example, I don't have to say that Bob is furious. The guy stood, knocked over his chair and slammed the damn door. We know he's angry. And, that shows his emotional state without me having to tell you in so many words. So trust your reader. And my first critique partner, Michelle, she taught me that too. She's pretty smart. But, trust your reader to put it together. And I think one of the pitfalls I would fall into is that I would show, but then I would add a line that was telling. So, I might write something that is like the showing example that I made, but then I would preface it with Bob was furious. Well, I don't need to put that in there. I don't need to explain.
I would do the same thing.
Yeah. So I would often piggyback it but I really didn't need it. So that was one of the pitfalls that I used to fall into. And sometimes I still do and then end up I don't really have to say that. I'm showing it.
So tip number 2, avoid long passages of unnecessary exposition. Exposition is when you interrupt the story to explain things. The key words being interrupt and explain. That frequently happens when something new is introduced, either a new technology, a new character, a new location, etc. And you know what I'm talking about. Jane Doe steps onto the scene and suddenly we're given the backstory of how when kids, she would taunt the protagonist about his long hair. Or a book I read where the jester walked on stage, and then like the next 3 to 4 pages were dedicated to the politics of the royal court and how it came to be that this jester had the ear of the king. Rather than relay all the information in one long chunk, let the characters relay the important information through their action. Now, notice I said important action, important information. Like, let's go back to the jester thing, because that book really bugged me when he did it. What's the important piece of information? Is it the whole 200 years of court politics, or is it that this jester has the ear of the king? Skip the pages of politics and instead show the jester showing his elevated status by, for example, he helps himself to an apple and says, "You didn't laugh once during my performance. What is wrong?" Showing that they have a relationship. Think of your exposition as need to know. And I know that you guys, historical fiction writers, it's really tempting to want to throw in every piece of research you find because it's all fascinating, which is why we said new location. Like, you get to a scene where you're setting the scene and you really want to talk about why those buildings were so important and why this happened, or why this happened a few months earlier, right before the action. Decide what the reader needs to know for the story. It always needs to serve the story. And then, rather than explain it, show it in the actions of the characters.
Oh. All right. Tip number 3, do not mistake dialogue for showing. So exposition set in dialogue is still exposition. And then hand in hand with that is do not mistake adjectives for showing.
Yes.
So I'm gonna tackle that one first and come back to dialogue. So when I was writing my 4th manuscript, and I remember this occasion very well, is we were still in Calgary, and the computer was in our bedroom, and I was writing this manuscript, and my husband read a paragraph over my shoulder where I described a hospital room, and it literally read like a list of articles with adjectives like small and blue and cold. And my husband mocked it. And so incidentally, he's never read anything that I've written since. He's not a fiction reader. It's okay. He reads like nonfic and stuff, but I get it. I'm not offended. But he was right. It wasn't particularly creative, and it didn't reveal anything about my character. So, it's when you're using adjectives, that's not really showing. That's just giving an added descriptor. And then as far as dialogue, and we chatted about this in our section on dialogue and avoiding the, as you know, Bob, moments. And it, like you were saying, it's so easy to do this with research, especially historical fiction writers, or like even anything with world building, right? There's a point that you want to get across or a tidbit you want to include. And so you're tempted to avoid exposition and put it in dialogue because that's active, right? Yep. And it is. I mean, that is a technique you can use, but it comes down to the execution, because it doesn't work if it draws the reader out of the story and it is put in such a way that it is so transparently planted. So if you use dialogue to impart information, it has to arise organically within the story, and the dialogue itself has to sound natural. So the example, and I think this is the same example I used in our segment on dialogue. And When the World Fell Silent, which is my historical, I have a section where everyone is sitting around the table when Nora arrives home. And she's been at the hospital all day and doesn't know anything about what's going on in Halifax since the explosion. And so I wanted to give the reader information about, not just the very insular world of the hospital, but what's going on in the city at large. And I did it through dialogue. And also I added action and movement to the scene and emotional beats. So sitting around the table, they're all exhausted, emotional, and talking about it as people normally would after something like that happened. They get together at the end of the day and want to talk about it. So the purpose isn't just for the reader to gain information. It's for the reader to feel the overwhelm and numbness of grief that Nora feels as the bigger picture comes into focus. And I think that's the key, is that it's not about the information. It's about the reader really putting themselves in Nora's shoes and in her head and getting the emotional reaction, not just, the stats. I mean, honestly, that's why I love historical fiction more than learning history. Going to a history class, I could get all the facts I wanted and I was bored. But when it's in the context of story and characters that I care about, it comes alive for me. So, yeah.
All right. Tip number 4. Avoid overusing explanatory words and phrases that filter the emotions. I'm kind of glad I got this tip because I am going to do this week with the novella I just finished. When you use words like feel, felt, because, wanted, then, seemed, these are words that attach the explanation to the actions. He grabbed a glass because he was thirsty. He felt cold. He wanted an egg sandwich. These are things that you, the writer, are interrupting the story to give information. And remember, every time you do that, you take the reader out of the scene or out of the character's head and put them in yours. So instead, what you want to do is convey emotion or motivation in a scene by using action word and active words. He devoured an egg sandwich. Cold ran down her spine. How's it going? She slurred. Her breath reeked of gin and rhubarb. These are all things that say the exact same thing, but they're more active. And I was thinking about it because it's very common to do when you're doing first person, I think, because first person is very easy to fall into the, I felt cold, I wanted this, I did this, and you need to go through and kind of fix it with more active words.
Yeah, and I think it's about hitting like immediacy with your verbs. Yep. Like visceral, making your language visceral, like you said, and it creates like a layer of distance between the actual feeling and the verb and the reader. So like you said, like with he felt cold, but okay, so he felt cold, well, this is me and that's him. But if you use it as, cold shivered down his spine or something a little more visceral, like we can almost feel that.
Right. And, it's like I said, it is easy to fall into the trap when you're first person because it's the person relaying the story.
Right.
And I think that's a lot of times why you get first person present versus first person past, because it does keep it more immediate.
Actually, I think it depends on the writer maybe, because I'm thinking about writing in first person, and because I had written one of my characters in third and one in first, and now they're both in first, and I had to change the third person to first. And when I did that and I adjusted my verbs, I found it much more active and immediate. So
I agree with that. And I
think it depends. And I think it depends on how you handle point of view and your own voice.
Yes. If that is true. And I think that when I was saying first person present, I think there's a lot of people, it's like, I walk into the room and there he is. They're saying in the present versus first person past, which is what, I tend to use.
Right. And I used past as well. And just because we could do a whole other thing on point of view.
Funny, we should say that though. Tip number 5.
Yeah, is use the power of point of view. So we talked earlier when we did our show on point of view about the camera lens. And so omniscient point of view, third person, is the wide lens. It's all seeing. But then you get to like a limited third person, and that's when you're in the character's head. And then first person point of view can even be more intimate because, rather than she, her, and he, his, or theirs, it's me and my. And so that draws the reader sometimes even closer if they like point of view. I mean, it's all very down to personal preference. But if you go really deep into that point of view, the reader's going to be right in that head with you. And that is where the emotion lies and makes your characters and story memorable, and what makes a reader pick up your next book, because deep point of view, really getting into the depth of your character, is a great way to get the reader to go along for the ride. So the wider your narrative view, the more telling you'll do. Conversely, the narrower your view, the more showing you'll do. I'm talking with my hands like crazy today, and it's probably all off camera. The best tip I can give for really digging really deeply into point of view is to use sensory language. So what does the character see, hear, smell, touch, and taste? When you use sensory language to experience the story through the character and not about the character, you're showing and not telling.
We will do, you'll agree with me on one caveat about the senses. Limit it to like one dominant sense. Don't.
Oh, yeah. Don't write like 4 paragraphs about everything. It's not like when you're trying to like list 5 things you can touch, list 5 things you can see. Like, no, it's but experience it through the senses rather than just telling the reader what the character is experiencing.
Which leads us to the last tip, though, what I was saying, use a mixture of showing and telling. It all depends. You want to do, it's the same way you want to do a variety of POV. You don't want your lens to always stay at the same distance. Too much showing is just as bad as too much telling. You never want too much of one thing or the other. You want to make a nice blend of recipe. So how much is too much? The answer is...
How long is a piece of string?
I wish there was a formula that you could say it must be 60% this and 40% this, but it's not. It depends a lot on your voice. It depends on the genre, and in a very granular way, it's going to depend on the scene. Like, for example, say you're writing a fight scene. In a scene like this, you're going to want to use action to grab the reader. You're going to use very taut, very sharp prose to convey what's happening, but you're not going to want to bog the scene down with a lot of feelings or reactions. You're going to be pulling back to do that wide lens to say what's happening. She jumped on Don. She grabbed his waist and hurled him across the room. You want to show, you're going to tell more than you show because you want to keep the pace going. On the other hand, if you have the aftermath scene where the protagonist is staring out at the battlefield to look at the damage, or it's a love scene, or any scene where you want the reader to feel the emotion of the moment, then you're going to want to slow it down. That's the time to show. That's the time to really experience the moment through the character's eyes and give the reader that visceral reaction. The best advice I can give is to read as many books in your own genre that you want to write as possible. Because you're going to have to figure out how other authors balance it. Every genre has its own kind of tone and way of doing things, and every author has their own special voice. The only way you're going to find your voice in balance is to do a lot of reading, a lot of studying of how other authors do it, and then figure out how you feel comfortable.
And then a lot of writing to find your own rhythm and way of doing it.
Exactly. Obviously, we've only scratched the surface here. I mean, there is only so much you can say in 30 minutes, but like we said at the beginning, show versus tell, or show don't tell, is not an easy concept. I am a huge fan of a book called Understanding Show Don't Tell by Janice Hardy. It's a friend of mine recommended it because she said it was the first time she ever understood show don't tell really well. And I got to admit, she does a great job in this book of breaking down the information. And she also has a YouTube episode where she does it. So we will post the link to both in the story notes, and I recommend watching and reading.
Yeah, and it's funny because we referenced show don't tell in so many of our earlier episodes because it affects almost everything that you do in your book. So it affects pacing, it affects your character development, how you write dialogue, the concept of scene versus sequel. Like there's just so much. And you
can also get yourself hung up on thinking about too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, and we talked about it in point of view with deep point of view. And I do think for me, and it all depends on how your mind works. Like, so for me, deep point of view is usually the way to go. And then, then I look at pacing. If it feels like it's slow and bogged down, I know I probably either need to cut it or make this more of a sequel and move on. So,
and the number one rule, if it serves the story, that's good. If it doesn't serve the story, get rid of it.
I think all of our writing room, like for this whole year, I think the whole thing really is boiled down to it has to serve the story. I think that's our whole thing.
That's it.
The end.
So what's coming up next, Donna?
All right. So next month is November, and I can't believe we are into like the second last month of 2023. Like, it's just blowing my mind.
Oh, it's crazy.
It's yeah. So, and it's going to be a busy month. So we're kicking it off on the 7th at our usual time, 2 p.m. Eastern. And we're talking about The Cuban Heiress by Chanel Clayton. And we're going to be live, and would love if you guys all read along and chatted with us. This is my first book by Clayton, and it's beyond time I rectified that. So I'm really looking forward to that.
I've read her before. She's really good.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward. I have another one of hers on my Kindle, and it's a case of, you know, so many books, so little time. Then on November 14th, we're doing things a little differently. Our featured author is going to be a little bit earlier this month because of the U.S. holiday. And we're going to be joined by our friend and indie author, Janet Ray Stevens. She writes a blend of time travel and historical fiction based in World War II. They're really funny and they're quirky. And so is Janet. And we're just really looking forward to having her on.
I think that's going to be a really fun interview.
It will definitely be a really fun interview. And then our last writing room episode is next month. And that's because in December, we're going to have our end of the year sort of summary, fun redux kind of thing. So we're going to have our writing room, and it's basically about what's next on, you know, after your first draft is finished. And it's going to be perfect because November is NaNoWriMo month. So write a book in a month. And so getting ready for the next steps is perfect timing.
That is. So as always, if you liked our show, please like and subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/@StepIntoTheStoryBooks. Even better, why not you join our Facebook community, which is facebook.com/groups/StepIntoTheStory, where we post, we chat, we keep it going all week long.
We do.
All month long. 365 days a week, a year.
365 days a week. Oh my God. No wonder the year's been long. No.
It's a great place to chat historical fiction. We really love for people to join and hang out with us. And we really appreciate you all watching. I know a lot of you watch after the fact. So those of you who are tuning in after this is live version, thank you very much. And those of you who tuned in live, thank you too.
All right. We will see you next time.
Bye-bye.